A divided nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence. Slavery in America. The time was 1860, and Americans had a problem. It wasn't a new problem. They'd been living with it since before the nation began. These were the words in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. It had turned out that not all people were treated as equal in the United States. One large group of people was not even free. In America, there were people just like you and me who lived lives as prisoners despite the fact that they had committed no crime. If they tried to escape, they faced armed patrols and attack dogs. Slavery was a part of America from the very beginning. Slavery had come to the land with the Spanish and English settlers in the 1600s. For hundreds of years in the United States, wealthy white landowners benefited from the institution of slavery, which forced millions of African people to be enslaved and work their entire lives on giant farms. But these weren't the first to enslave people on the American continents. Some Native American nations had used captives as slaves. It was an evil but common practice across the world. There were jobs that no one wanted to do, and in the days before machinery, enslaving people seemed an answer. Slavery is the brutal practice of forcing someone to work hard without paying them a fair wage, sometimes without paying them at all. In colonial times, there was slavery in both North and South. After the Revolutionary War in the 1780s, slavery was outlawed in most northern states. Slavery in the South. The situation was different in the South. From the earliest colonial times, the crops that grew well there, tobacco, cotton, rice, and sugar, demanded that large numbers of field workers. But there were few workers to be had until a Dutch ship arrived at Jamestown in 1619 with captured African people on board. At first, the African people were indentured servants. Then the white landowners enslaved them so that they could have an easy source of labor. After the Revolutionary War, slave laws grew harsher and harsher in the South. Slavery raised issues besides economics. One was racism, the belief that one race is superior to another. Many Southerners, and Northerners too, believed Africans were savages and they were civilizing them. They believed that the white race was superior. That was a racist idea, and it would lead to evil action wherever it was expressed. It was the same racism that made the settlers treat Native Americans so cruelly. In the United States, enslaved people were all people of color, and there was the issue of right and wrong. Some Northerners and some Southerners thought slavery morally wrong, yet few of them were willing to do anything about it. In the early years of the United States, this difference between the North and South created problems. But as the United States began expanding west and new states were added, a conflict began to develop. Southerners wanted slavery to expand to these new states. They wanted the new territories in the West to be slave territories. Northerners didn't. Remember, many of the white people at the time who didn't like slavery kept quiet. They didn't do anything about it. Was that wrong? Why didn't they speak out? Maybe because it wasn't easy to attack slavery. Those who did speak out weren't very popular, especially in the South. They were called abolitionists because they wanted to abolish or end slavery. Today we know that the abolitionists wanted to do the right thing. But if you want to understand history, to understand why things happened the way they did, you have to try to think as people did in the past. You have to put yourself in their times. Slavery had been around for a long time, but people who weren't enslaved didn't realize or didn't want to realize how terrible it was. Most Northerners didn't know any enslaved people, and many white Southerners fooled themselves into thinking the enslaved were happy. What would happen to the South's economy if slavery were abolished? No one knew. It was said that business in the North as well as the South would be hurt. To people who were content with things as they were, the abolitionists seemed like troublemakers. The Southern leaders wanted to change things too. They wanted slavery to extend to the Western territories. They wanted to be able to bring enslaved people with them when they traveled to the North. They said that the whole nation needed to allow slavery. In the South, leaders like John C. Calhoun said that slavery was a wonderful, God-inspired system, good for those enslaved and good for the nation. The leaders of the South blamed the Northerners for all their troubles. They couldn't believe that their ideas needed changing. The leaders of the South were terrified that they might lose their slaves, who were the key to their wealth. Others, like Abraham Lincoln, however, saw clearly that slavery was evil and could only breed more evil. "We began," said Lincoln, "by declaring that all men are created equal. But now, from the beginning, we have run down to the other declaration, that for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of government. These principles cannot stand together." By 1860, there was no way around it. If the Union was to survive and be true to its founding principles, there would have to be a war. Americans fighting Americans. It was the worst war in American history. It was called the Civil War, or the War Between the States. And sometimes brother fought brother and father fought son. More than 620,000 Americans died. Cities were destroyed, farms burned, homes leveled, and on one bloody day, at a place called Antietam, more men were killed than on any other day in all of U.S. history. The total deaths were almost as many as in all of our other wars combined. If the same percentage of today's population were killed, it would mean 5 million deaths. It was the South against the North, and although the North won, neither side came out ahead. The South, which had once been prosperous, was in ruins. The North was left with huge war debts, and both North and South had the graves of fathers, sons, and husbands to weep over. What was it all about? Why were Americans fighting Americans? When the war began, people on both sides claimed they weren't fighting over slavery, but they were fooling themselves. Before the end of the war, it was clear. Slavery was the main issue. Most white Southerners wanted to keep slavery because they thought their way of life depended on it. Most Northerners thought slavery was wrong and that, as Abraham Lincoln said, the nation could not exist half slave and half free. There were other issues, too. The Southerners, who were called rebels, believed in states' rights. They thought any state should have the right to pull out of the United States. They usually called it the Union. They said it was tyranny to hold states in the Union against their wishes. They said this was just like the Revolutionary War fight against England. They said they were doing the same thing that George Washington and John Adams and the other revolutionaries had done against King George, fight for their freedom. But it was white freedom they were fighting for. They didn't want to consider the fact that they were the ones who were tyrannizing others. They had been tyrannizing enslaved people for hundreds of years. What the Southerners did do was form their own nation. 11 Southern states seceded from the Union. They created the Confederate States of America and elected a president and a Congress. The North wouldn't let them do it. "Revolution is only right," said President Abraham Lincoln, "for a morally justified cause." But the South had no just cause. So, said Lincoln, secession was simply a wicked exercise of physical power. Lincoln fought to prove that democracy could work. The Northerners, who were also called Yankees or Federals, were willing to fight for the American form of government, for the Constitution, for the Union. They said that when the states joined the Union, they agreed to uphold the Constitution and they couldn't just pull out anytime they wanted. If that were allowed, soon there would be no Union at all. An end to a war, an end to slavery, but not to all problems. The Confederate troops of the South, led by General Lee, surrendered to the Union troops of the North, led by Ulysses S. Grant, on April 9, 1865, officially ending the Civil War. The North had won. The war had accomplished much. The United States had withstood the terrible fire of civil war and showed that its citizens were willing to die and save it. They had shown the strength of the freely elected democratic government of America. Something else was remarkable. Lincoln had said, "This nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom." And after the war it happened. 3 new amendments were passed, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and made the Constitution stronger and better. They made right those things that had not been right when the Constitution was written in 1789. Slavery was no more. The new amendment said that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were meant to protect all Americans, no matter how much money they had or what the color of their skin was. New laws stated clearly that unfairness was wrong. Black men, by law, were full citizens. But the war did not cure all of our country's evils. More than 600,000 people, mostly young men, had died. Almost 500,000 more would live the rest of their lives with a missing arm or leg or a painful wound. Some Northerners were very angry. After all, it was the South that had started the war. White Southerners were equally angry, confused, hurt, and miserable. The South lay in ruins. Everything they fought for was gone. Gone with the wind, said one Southern woman in a famous book. A generation of Southern gentlemen were dead. Southern whites had to blame someone for their misery. 4 million black Southerners were free. But free to do what? Where would they go? What would they do? Would they really be granted the equality they deserved, the equality they were guaranteed by the Constitution and its new amendments? The battle against slavery was over, but the battle against racism was not over.